In the autumn of 2013, Thomson Reuters Foundation surveyed gender specialists across 22 Arab states. The aim was to gauge the state of women's rights 3 years after the Arab Spring and as Syria's conflict threatens further regional upheaval. The poll looked at 6 big themes: gender violence, reproductive rights, women in the family, in the economy, in society, and in politics. To many people's surprise, Egypt ranked worst for women's rights overall, followed by Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Lebanon, Palestinian territories, Somalia, Djibouti, Bahrain, Mauritania, UAE, Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Qatar, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Comoros at number 1. The results were sobering. 3 out of 5 Arab Spring countries came in the bottom 5 states for women's rights. Despite hopes that women would be the prime beneficiaries of the Arab Spring, they have instead become some of the biggest losers. Egypt is the case in point. The experts cited endemic harassment, an increase in gender violence, a rollback of rights amid a rise in Islamist influence, and high rates of female genital mutilation for its place at the bottom of the ranking. The findings generated headlines and ignited debate across the world.
Women were better off under Mubarak than today. It's unbelievable when you think of what happened almost 3 years ago on Tahrir Square.
استطلاع قائم على منظور المستطلع آراء.
وتضع علامات استفهام كبيرة.
This was the third poll we organized on women's rights. The first one was 2 years ago, and it was what are the most dangerous countries for women to live in. And surprisingly, for the ones who didn't know, India came number 4, and many wonder how it was possible that the biggest democracy in the world was such a bad place for women to live in. But then we did last year a second poll, which was the ranking of the G20 for the G20 countries for women to live in, and India came last after Saudi Arabia. So what we heard this morning on the difficulty to prosecute crime against a woman is, of course, part of that. We heard also that it's going to change, so it's good. I'm going to introduce now the plenary, which is very important on the women's rights in the Arab world, where we will focus on 3 countries only: Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, where the carnage goes on. But first, I'm going to introduce the keynote speaker for this plenary, Sir Suma Chakrabarti. I hope I don't massacre your name. I trained. During the past 3 years, the region has changed faster than anyone could have ever anticipated. From the gatherings on Tahrir Square to the death of Colonel Gaddafi, the political landscape has totally changed, but the transformation is still in motion. With a number of key forces fighting, the picture is grim, undoubtedly. Sir Suma is the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He is in a unique position since his bank has seen his mandate expanded to the countries of the Arab Spring last year, I think, to help the transition towards democracy. He is personally a great believer in the necessity to create equal economic opportunities for women. The EBRD has been particularly active in Egypt, in Morocco, in Jordan, and Tunisia, investing in these 4 countries alone over 429 million euros in 17 different projects. And I'm now pleased especially pleased to have Sir Suma talking about women's rights, as this reinforced the point that gender equality is not and should not be an issue for women, but for the whole humankind. I just want to add that Sir Suma has extensive experience in international development, economics and policy making. His previous experience spans from senior roles at the British Ministry of Justice and DFID, the UK Department for International Development. Please join me in welcoming Sir Suma.
Well, thank you very much, Monique. I should start by saying I hope I've got the right speech in front of me, and but you never know. I'm sure I have. First of all, I want to say really how proud I am to be here, even if only briefly. We at EBRD are really proud sponsors of this conference, second year running, really because issues are incredibly important, not just to our institution, but to us as human beings. I think it's a really fundamental set of issues, and I'm glad that we're taking a full part in this. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think I want to start by saying that for us at the EBRD, but for all of us here, I guess, at the conference, the key point is that women are vital agents of change. Indeed, I'd go further than that. I'd argue that their participation in politics and their active engagement in civil society and government decision-making are not just key ingredients to building a democracy and an inclusive society. Without them, it's difficult to speak of real democracy at all, in my view. Now, we all witnessed striking proof of this in the changes that swept through the Middle East and North Africa after December 2010. And during those days, I recall well that women and men marched together for change. All across the region, wherever democratic movements gained momentum, women were also highly visible and vocal on social media. Women expressed their frustration at the status quo through other public spaces as well, such as art and culture. And yet, if we look at those same public spaces today, at the end of 2013, those women who campaigned for freedom, for justice, and more opportunities alongside men seem to have, well, in some contexts, disappeared from view. Indeed, women's very presence at public events sometimes provokes hostility now. In some countries, this, and I guess the broader climate, risk undermining the rights that women gained after their countries received independence from colonial powers. Now, what we know for sure is that the campaign for real gender equality goes on. The World Economic Forum's 2013 Global Gender Gap Index shows that many Arab nations rank lowest of the 135 countries worldwide. They all displayed very large disparities between men and women in economic participation, educational attainment, health and political empowerment. And despite progress made in the last few years, the Middle East and North Africa stands out as a region with the largest gender gap. A recent survey by our hosts today, the Thomson Reuters Foundation, bears this out, and you saw the video that gives us some of that data. The survey covered issues such as violence against women, reproductive rights, treatment of women within the family, their integration into society, and attitudes towards women's role in politics and the economy. Its results are truly alarming, in my view. Out of 22 Arab states, 5 Arab Spring countries came bottom for women's rights. So it begs the question, were the encouraging events of the last few years merely a temporary blip? I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. I would argue, in fact, that women's active participation in state building in the region is nothing new. It has a long and rather proud history. Women played a major role in their country's struggle for independence. In Tunisia, the first women's association, the Tunisian Women's Islamic Union, was created back in 1936. Before independence, the speeches of Habib Bourguiba, the nationalist leader and later the country's first president, insisted that its development and prosperity depended upon everyone taking part, women and men alike. In Morocco, in 1946, the Sisters of Purity Association issued a set of demands, including the abolition of polygamy, full and equal political rights, and increased visibility of women in the public sphere. Female journalists, academics, and civil society built on these demands after independence. In Jordan, too, the Jordanian Women's Union was set up in 1945, and when the kingdom actually gained independence from Britain, the movement was very active in demanding greater political, social, legal, and economic rights for women. In Egypt as well, many associations devoted to women's issues were established, and secondary schools opened for women in the 1930s. Egypt's main university, the University of Cairo, accepted its first female student even before then. Egyptian women were granted the right to vote in the 1950s, and in the first elected parliament after the revolution of 1952, 5 women stood in the elections and 2 of them won seats. The Egyptian constitution of 1956 explicitly asserted the equality of opportunity for men and women. That's the history lesson. It's quite an interesting history lesson for me, and I hope for all of us, that there is a tradition here in these countries that one should try and build on. And we can still see the legacy of those ideals and aspirations today. But the problem is that on many fronts, they've remained just that, ideals, aspirations, that exist more on paper, on the statute books, than in the reality of everyday life. Women in most countries of the region enjoy legal equality with men with respect to issues such as freedom of movement, healthcare, education, political participation, and access to employment. But in some cases, they still suffer from discrimination with regards to nationality and citizenship, and cannot, in fact, pass their citizenship to their spouses or children. Women face gender-based discrimination in personal status laws, which regulate marriage, divorce, child guardianship, inheritance, and other aspects of family life. Laws in most of the region declare that the husband is the head of the family, give the husband power over his wife's right to work, and in some instances specifically require the wife to obey her husband. In the world of employment, the combination of poor education and societal pressure to work in certain professions or industries has led most working women to take up low-paying jobs. Women also suffer from unequal pay, despite the fact that most labor codes mandate equal salaries for work of equal value. The World Bank's 2012 World Development Report on Gender Equality and Development argues that there is indeed a gap in the MENA region between advancement in education and healthcare on the one hand, and economic contribution on the other hand. Not because women are necessarily jobless, but because women have poorer quality jobs or work without actually getting paid for their labor. Now, while many women participate in civil society and community-based activities, they are significantly underrepresented at senior levels, both in politics and the private sector. According to the latest data, women's representation in parliaments in the region barely reached 16%, almost 10% below the OECD average. Another significant problem for women that I should mention here is the gender-based violence that was mentioned in the video and all its consequences on women's lives. Women also face gender-based discrimination due to traditional assumptions about the way that they should behave in public. The upshot of all of this is that many women in this region, even those who are educated and come from relatively privileged backgrounds, cannot play a full role as yet in the economy, nor can they achieve full financial independence. The gaps are highest, of course, for women living in the rural areas who face many challenges related to just basic access to services. Where does the EBRD stand on these issues? Well, we, as Monique said, as an international financial institution, we are committed to the promotion of inclusive societies in emerging Arab democracies. And as I suggested earlier, we do not think that a functioning market economy based on democratic principles is possible without equal rights and opportunities for women. So we see one of our main challenges for the years to come to be the adoption of an institutional and policy framework necessary to end inequalities in law, but another will be to ensure that laws are actually enforced and implemented fairly and consistently. And for the latter to happen, we need to raise both the awareness and the commitment to creating an enabling environment in the countries that we work in. We'll also need both men and women to be committed to changing society. Now, clearly, the likelihood of this happening depends on the countries themselves and their leaders. It doesn't depend on EBRD management saying so. It's much more than that. But I am convinced that international institutions, including the EBRD, can play an important role in supporting change and speaking up for change. Now, the EBRD has been promoting the emergence and growth of democratic market economies in Central and Eastern Europe and Central Asia since its creation in 1991. Now, at the request of our shareholders, we're investing in Jordan, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and in Egypt. Over the 2 decades of our existence, supporting private enterprise and investing in improving the business climate has proven to be a powerful tool for fostering broad-based economic prosperity for both men and women. Now, lack of access to finance and employment are among the main reasons why women suffer from inequality. This is particularly true in the Middle East and North Africa, where their labour force participation remains the lowest worldwide, despite high levels of education. And that's something that I think that's worth debating. It's often known as a MENA paradox. Furthermore, in some regions, such as the Maghreb, the public sector has provided the lion's share of female employment, while the private sector has been rather men-dominated. There needs to be change, obviously. To help women enter the labour market, as well as to support their entrepreneurial activities, we have to invest in programs which provide women with the opportunity to learn skills that are in demand by the private sector. This needs to take place alongside investment in entrepreneurship support programs, addressing issues such as collateral related to women's access to finance, developing specific finance products for women, and facilitating access to services. We've started on this road in EBRD. In Turkey, the bank has been successfully supporting domestic banks there in offering women-only credit lines for female entrepreneurs. I'm really hopeful we can take this approach to the Middle Eastern and North African countries in which we now invest. So we support women's economic empowerment. We see it as inextricably linked to their social and political empowerment. We do so to help them become independent and ensure their voices are heard and their rights are respected. Like their peers in other countries, women in the region deserve to live in a society where they can be agents of their own destiny. Now, I've said this already today, but I truly believe that women's economic, social, and political inclusion is absolutely key to democratic progress. If we at the EBRD can boost participation, inclusion, and gender equality in the region through our work there, and I know we can, we too can do our bit to deepen democracy. I believe, and I would say this standing here, I believe strongly that men too play an important role in eliminating gender inequality. We need to help today's men and boys to gain a better understanding of the benefits for all of the importance of gender equality and women's rights in the economy and the rest of society. The changes currently underway in the region offer a real opportunity for long-term democratic reforms. We should seize this opportunity. I'm an optimist about where those changes are leading, but I also believe that those changes will only deliver truly inclusive and prosperous democracies if they remove the barriers to women's access to services, to finance, to employment, and to political participation, and strengthen women's role in society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suma. It's always good to remind everybody that nothing will change for the woman's status if not with the full consent and power of men, of course. We are now going to have this extraordinary panel with 3 extremely brave women who have done their role in the revolution in their country. But let me introduce Shereen El Feki, because she is the one that will moderate the plenary, and herself is a very important person for the Middle East. Half Egyptian and half Welsh, Shereen is uniquely suited to moderating this panel. She's a journalist and author, and she splits her time between Cairo and London. Shereen has worked as a correspondent at The Economist and as a presenter with Al Jazeera English. Her latest book, Sex and the Citadel, asked the question of whether the Arab Spring will precipitate a sexual revolution. It doesn't look like, but one never knows. Using interviews, statistics, opinion polls, and personal insights, Shereen paints a vibrant picture of a society wrestling with tradition versus modernization. It's a very good read, and Shereen, I let you introduce your panel.
All right, well, if my panelists would like to come up on stage. Let me just begin by thanking Monique and the Thomson Reuters Foundation for putting women's rights in the Arab world front row and center at this conference, but also in the work that the foundation does in the rest of the year. As Monique mentioned, my particular area of interest is the sexual life of men and women across the Arab world, and I look at what is happening in the bedroom and how that relates to shifts on a bigger stage in politics and economics and in social life. And it's that bigger stage that we're going to focus on over the next 90 minutes or so. And we're going to look at the position of women in the Arab region almost 3 years now after the beginning of the Arab uprisings. As Monique mentioned, we're going to focus on 3 countries in particular that have been shaken and stirred by upheaval: Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. But of course, the ground is moving more or less underneath our feet wherever we are in the Arab region. So many of the trends and the phenomena that we're going to talk about in the context of these countries is also playing out across the Arab region. And as we heard earlier today, around the world, we are not unique in the challenges facing women in the Arab region. And we very much look forward to hearing your perspectives from across the Arab region and from around the world as well when we go into our question and comments. Now, the title of our session today is effectively, Has the Arab Spring Turned to Winter for Women? And I feel at the moment we should sort of cue the Vivaldi, because really in these days you see 4 seasons playing out in a single week. And that's because we are taking many twists and turns on our scenic route to democracy in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in the region. At last year's Trust Women's Conference, the discussion was very much focused on the impact of Islamist governments and their policies on women's rights and opportunities. In 2013, that official Islamist influence appears to have receded. But what a difference a year makes, or possibly not. In Egypt, we are struggling to throw off the shackles of authoritarian regimes. Tunisia is in turmoil. And Syria is a tragedy whose denouement will be wrenching, no matter how this tragedy and how this drama plays out. Now, we need to keep in mind that there are very few countries in the world that have made the transition from decades of colonial occupation to decades of military dictatorship to a fully functioning liberal democracy in a single tidy bound. We are in the middle of what is a very messy shift, and our challenge really, and our question is, how can we get ourselves on a path that will lead to the political, economic, and social structures that will fully recognize and uphold human rights? In this session, we are going to look at today, we're going to look at tomorrow, and we're going to discuss the major obstacles, but also the small victories that women are experiencing in Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria. And to take us through this tour of these countries, I'm delighted to be joined by panelists who are really on the forefront of change. Mona Eltahawy is a well-known Egyptian-American journalist and blogger, and Mona has herself been on the sharp end of the state's attentions, and this has only served to spur her interest and her advocacy of women's rights in Egypt and across the Arab world. Amira Yahyaoui, is a Tunisian peace activist, and she's also the president of Bawsala. It's an NGO that monitors the Constitutional Assembly and Parliament in Tunisia, and it advocates for human rights, among them protection of freedom of expression. Amira was also an independent candidate in Tunisia's first parliamentary elections, and I hope that will not be your last time going to the polls as a candidate. Rola Hallam is a British Syrian doctor. She works in anaesthesia and intensive care. Rola has been on the front lines of Syria's civil war. She is a volunteer with Hand in Hand Syria, and she has been working to relieve the suffering of women and children who were caught up in the conflict. Volker Türk is a Director of International Protection at the UN High Commission for Refugees. Volker has experience in such hot spots as Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And now he's grappling with the crisis of Syrian refugees. I think there are almost estimated 4 million now refugees and internally displaced people. And you need to keep in mind that these are numbers that are adding to the millions already in the region, whether it is from the unrest in Yemen or the Libyan civil war or the long-standing humanitarian crises in our region. Our panel have impressive credentials, but I will leave it to you to go to the website of the Trust Women Conference to read through their bios if you want more information. Finally, a word about this session. We're going to discuss these issues in the panel, and then it will be over to you for questions and comments. In the spirit of the Arab Spring, we are hoping for a free and frank exchange of views, and possibly even a few protests. And in order to facilitate that, we would be very grateful if you could please silence your mobile phones now. So in the first instance, I really want to pick up on the excellent remarks and the sort of tour d'horizon of Sir Suma, and really look at one of the issues which is often overlooked in our region, which is the economic empowerment of women. As Sir Suma mentioned, education has actually been one of the success stories in the Arab region, getting women into education, albeit not of the best quality in most of our countries. Nonetheless, if we look at many of our states, we find that there are equivalent levels of male and female literacy. We have comparable numbers of boys and girls in primary, even secondary school. And in some parts of the region, we actually have more women than men in universities. But as Sir Suma mentioned, that is not translating into employment. And the World Bank Gender and Development Report he cited pointed out that across the Arab region, only 25% of women on average are in the workforce. And that's about half of the average for the global South. Now, we know that economics, unemployment is a huge driver of the unrest that we're seeing across our region. And I was really taken by a comment from Sima Samar yesterday, and she pointed out quite trenchantly, when you are economically independent, you can act as a woman. If you are dependent on the men in your family, you have to wait even to stitch a button. So Mona, I'd like to turn to you first because you have tremendous experience working with women across the social spectrum in Egypt. What difference does it make to women in their everyday lives to have a job?
I mean, it does and it doesn't, because even if you have a job and you make your own money, and here I'm talking about the more educated and more affluent classes in Egypt, you're still dealing with a great deal of, or you still have to face a great deal of misogyny and patriarchy across the region. But if I'm speaking about Egypt specifically, absolutely. So there are some things that cut across educational levels and economic levels, but I'll stick to the specifically economic. I'm thinking of women of, say, the upper middle classes who are very educated, who are in the professions, but who at the end of the day are women in a patriarchal society. So they might be economically independent, but they still have to face that. And then you can take that all the way to women. I think there are at least 30% of Egyptian homes that are female-led, in the sense that the women make all the money for the home, either because the man, the husband or the father is unemployed, or he's just disappeared on the family and no longer pays child support or alimony in the case of divorce. So obviously there, money and the finances of the home play a different role. But the point that I'm trying to get at is, yes, absolutely, when a woman makes her own money, she does have a great deal of independence. But at the end of the day, you're still heading butts with this patriarchal, misogynistic society. in which your money doesn't always protect you. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, specifically in countries like you mentioned, where there are more women than men on university campuses. And I'm thinking of the Gulf countries here, where there's still a lot of unemployment, but even for the women who are rich, it doesn't protect them against discriminatory laws. It doesn't protect them against attitudes towards women that don't consider gender equality and don't think of women as even deserving of equality with men.
So unnecessary, but certainly not sufficient.
Not the only thing, absolutely.
Criteria for women's empowerment. Amira, a question for you. Tunisia has a reputation, at least historically, of being more progressive on women's empowerment and women's rights. And yet, interestingly, it has also one of the lowest rates of female labor participation. What's holding women back from the workplace in Tunisia?
You're right about reputation.
That's indeed, we'll come to that.
The right word. Tunisia was the best country to talk about women's rights under the two dictatorships, whether it's under Ben Ali or the end of Bourguiba's presidency. And during these years, women's rights was what gives legitimacy to these dictatorships, which means the West is okay with these countries because they show unveiled women in TV.
It's a sort of whitewash.
And that, yes, and that was the image of Tunisia. But thanks to the revolution, we discovered what is our country and how women are living in our country. And actually, when you go out of Tunis and the regions just next to the sea, then you discover what are women of this country, and they are the larger majority. The second myth that we discovered after the revolution is the false rate of literacy and education. When we've been through years saying that Tunisian and Tunisian women are the most educated in the Arab region. They must open, they go to university, to schools. Yes, that's right. We have more women and girls in university in Tunisia than boys. But first is what kind of education? Very bad education. Second, which kind of people go to university? Close to the cities, they go to university. Third, we discovered during elections that many people couldn't even read the results or how to vote. And knowing that before that we had 99% of literacy in Tunisia officially. So now I'm going back to economy and jobs. This revolution started because of the problem of jobs and socioeconomic problems. It's true that women work, we have a lower rate of women workers than men, but we have many women who are not considered as workers because it's not a legal job like housekeeping women or in agriculture. They don't even have a Tunisian ID, so we can't even calculate them. They doesn't exist. These women does not exist. I was in Gasrin, Sidi Bouzid, these countries that we heard about them for the revolution, and these women, they didn't even had an ID, so they weren't even considered as Tunisian. So of course they're not in this percentage. Third, when you take Tunisia, for example, today, the business union, the head of the business union is a woman. She's Widad Bouchamawi. And you have many women who are very highly ranked in business and who are running big businesses. The second biggest business in Tunisia is led by a woman, Madam Loumi. So you have this huge difference, which is actually what happened in what is the Arab Spring, is the difference between an elite, which is the 1%, against the 99% who is suffering. And this is why we have these kind of percentage.
Volker, I'd like to turn to you because you're looking at women truly on the edge, and in particular women refugees, many of whom are detached from the main of their families and also the main breadwinner of the family, the man of the family who may, in the case of Syria, be fighting in the war. How are these women making ends meet?
Well, that's a very good question. Perhaps I could just give you a couple of facts and figures, because I think it's important to set it out in the broader context. We have registered with UNHCR at the moment 2.2 million Syrian refugees. The estimate is, if you also take into account some of the government estimates in the neighboring countries, that is Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, it's about 3 million. So we are actually at a massive crisis. If you compare it with in terms of magnitude and scope, we would actually go back to almost the Great Lakes crisis in the 90s. I mean, it is of that scope and of that magnitude. In terms of, if you go down deeper and look at the statistics, 50% are children out of the 2.2 that are registered with us. 75% of these children are under the age of 12. You have then you have about 30% women. I mean, it's between 75% and 80% depending on the country. So we are talking essentially here about 80% of this refugee population that are children, of course half of them girls, and women. And in terms of households, you have about 70,000 female-headed households in Jordan and in Lebanon alone. So that shows you the scope of the problem. And of course, refugee women, it's very difficult for them to, first of all, get to know their new environment, to be able to ensure that the issues, and we discuss this with them, for instance, education for the children is something extremely important. Well, if you look at the education rate, it's below 50% of Syrian children that have access to education. And it's not because of the governments not wanting to grant it. I mean, it is the sheer magnitude of the crisis. Just to give you another example, in Lebanon itself, you have about 300,000 Lebanese children of school age in public schools. We probably have about the same amount of Syrian children in Lebanon at the moment. So it gives you a little bit some of the worries and the protection risks that women face as a result of this massive displacement. I mean, the protection risks are the ones that arise typically in these environments. It's child labor for their children, it's early marriage issues, it's trafficking, it's sexual and gender-based violence issues, it's isolation, it's also obviously livelihood. So we mount a massive assistance program, but it's not enough. And at the same time, there is also a tremendous need for building resilience, investing in local communities, and making sure that the impact is also taken into account when it comes to host communities and host countries, because that's the other big dimension of this crisis. It has an enormous impact, an immense impact on host communities in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey.
And you're looking at refugees who are displaced to countries already with very high rates of unemployment. Both Rola and Volker, in your work in Syria, but also in the refugee centers, have you come across any efforts or any attempts by NGOs or homegrown efforts to try to help women economically, to try to find some way to make ends meet?
The answer is it hasn't been given a very high priority. So the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis has meant that it has completely overwhelmed governments, NGOs, and the international community in general. And there's what aid has been given has been focused very much on kind of provision of healthcare for trauma, for the victims of the violence. So there's very few initiatives on what you're saying. And I think it's important to realize there's been a huge shift in the role of women in Syria actually in the last couple of years, both for the refugees and for the internally displaced. I mean, over half of the population are homeless now. That's more than 13 million people are homeless, mainly women and children. And the answer is they're not making ends meet. Their roles have changed from the being at home mothers to the head of the family and actually the breadwinner. But they haven't got any of the tools to do it, because we talk about education and literacy rate, but a lot of these women probably left school when they were 10, 11, 12. They've not got any work experience. They haven't got any of the tools to actually take up jobs and make themselves financially viable, added to the fact that there aren't many opportunities. So there's not been a huge, from my experience, a huge emphasis on that. I don't know if that's what you found.
If I could just say one thing that struck me, both actually in relation to the Libya crisis, because we had about 150,000 Libyans who went into Tunisia during the crisis, but also I think a similar number, 200,000 into Egypt. There was a lot of people-to-people solidarity that is, I found truly amazing, especially looking at some of the debates that we see in Europe when it comes to opening homes. I mean, and there was woman-to-woman solidarity. I mean, I witnessed this myself. I went to Tatawin at the in one area which is quite an impoverished part of Tunisia. You're from there. Well, there you go. And I mean, it's. But you see, I mean, I was amazed by how Tunisian families, women take in Libyan families. And I think we see the same with Syrian families. So there's a lot of people-to-people solidarity. There is, however, also a saturation point, especially with the Syrian refugee crisis, because we're in the third year. And it really depletes the resources of host communities. So we are in a very, very serious situation when it comes to managing and working through this crisis as it prolongs.
Volker, one point, sadly, of women's occupation in refugee camps that we've heard quite a lot about is sex work and indeed trafficking as well, picking up on some of our discussions from yesterday. How serious a problem is this amongst the refugee women you've worked with?
I mean, the whole area of trafficking, of sexual violence, but also of sex work is unfortunately a phenomenon that you see in displaced, in refugee contexts. And obviously it affects women so much more than men and boys. It's an issue that is due to the vulnerability that women are confronted with, especially because of lack of livelihood opportunities, but also exploitative practices that we have, lack of law enforcement in some instances.
You don't have to be in a refugee camp to find that, sadly, across the Arab region.
I mean, yeah, and I think the issue is also is partly how serious it is taken by local police authorities, for instance, and to investigate, and sometimes it gets exacerbated, unfortunately, as well. So it does require a lot of work, especially with local partners, and we have in all the countries we have identified local non-governmental organizations that know the community extremely well, precisely to address this type of issues, but also to create safe spaces for women. And
could I just add something on that, actually, because it depends on how wide a definition you include. We're seeing a lot of evidence of men coming from the rest of the Arab world coming to protect the women and marry them with their kids and take them to their place of country, wherever it is, in the Gulf, etc. Some of them with very suspect histories, and some of them we're sure is actually trafficking. Seeing a huge rise in child marriages because families just don't know what to do with their kids, and especially when it's the mums on their own, and so a rise in child marriages as well. So I think it's not just about prostitution and sexual violence. It's all the other ramifications of being a very vulnerable group of people displaced by war and all of these other issues, which are sadly common.
I want to pick up on a point Amira made, which is about the fact that, and also you, Mona, who mentioned that economic empowerment necessary but not sufficient. And unless we have political structures which will ensure that any potential gains from our uprisings are shared with all, it will remain an elite, the elite who benefit. And I want to talk a little bit now about what's happening in terms of our political structures, our overarching structures, particularly in Tunisia and Egypt. Amira, Tunisia is, of course, struggling to draft a constitution. How involved are women in this process, and what progress do you see so far in putting women's rights really on the agenda, not just for show, but really in essence?
So we've been drafting this constitution for 2 years now, not like the Egyptian very quick constitution.
The Egyptian expressway. Yes.
Actually, I read the Egyptian constitution this morning, and I'm happy we took you 2 years. Yeah, regarding women's rights. And so in Tunisia, what happened is in the beginning, the Islamists won, and they came with their arrogance, saying, we won, so we lead this constitution, and this constitution will be more ours than yours, let's say. But civil society in Tunisia was very, very, I would even say violent on that, and was very, very fearless, and we had the change that we wanted. Meaning, now we are at the fourth draft of the Constitution, the final one, and we have that article that when I talked to Monique last year, I was taken as crazy, saying we will have the real equality in the Constitution. I don't know if you will succeed on that, but we have it. So we have this.
So can you explain specifically what the article is?
بالعربية. You can translate it. So I'm going to go back to it because I have it. So المواطنون والمواطنات متساوون في الحقوق والواجبات وهم سواء أمام القانون من غير تمييز.
بالإنجليزي?
Women and men are equal on rights and duties and without any discrimination. This is the article. It's the Article 20 of the last draft of the Constitution. But we had another problem, which was with the preamble of the Constitution, because you can write whatever in your Constitution, but when the preamble says تأسيساً على تعاليم الإسلام, which means based on the principles of Islam, you can put Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whatever, but it will be based on principles of Islam. So that was the biggest battle, is to change that sentence, and it changed it 2 weeks ago.
And what is the new preamble?
The new preamble is just a preamble saying, thanks to the revolution, blah, 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 we have this constitution.
there you have 3 years summarized.
Yeah. So today, the problem doesn't come from the Islamists, it comes from the progressists, we as progressists, because in our assembly, we have actually the second biggest percentage of women seating in a parliament in the world, okay, after Kenya. So we have more than 30% women sitting in our Constituent Assembly, means 66 MPs who are women, that's huge. But from the 66, there are only 9 women progressists, because the Progressist Party didn't put women in the lists, while we have 44 Islamists coming from only Nahda party. But when we talk about Islamist view, we have 51 MPs who are with Islamist view. And this is what is the real actually problem, because I like it when we say, the Islamists are threatening women, blah, blah, blah. I'm hearing this for 2 years now. But the problem comes for us, those who want equality and gender equality. We want gender equality just to talk about it, but we don't really do it in our countries, at least in Tunisia. When I see, for example, when you see the executive bureaus of political parties, and you see Majlis al-Shura, which is the Shura Council of Nahda. Shura Council of Nahda has at least 30% of women, while Executive Bureau of Progressive Party don't have 1 or 2 women just for the show. Yeah. So this is the real problem in political process that we are having in Tunisia, and I think it's the same. It's absolutely the same in Egypt, even worse.
Egypt sort of writ large. Mona, let's look at that for a moment. The draft constitution, it was just delivered to President Mansour yesterday. What are your thoughts on the new versus old, and by that I mean Morsi era, constitution vis-a-vis women's rights?
First of all, I'm impressed that you remember the name of our interim president, because most people in Egypt don't.
Well, they probably say El-Sisi.
Sisi, exactly. But you know Adli Mansour is our interim president. Look, we have huge problems with our constitution. Like Amira was saying, we go through constitutions and presidents as quickly as people go through gum. So it's just, we just speed them out, and not always wisely, and not always based on the best constitution in our history. By most constitutional experts in Egypt say that the 1954 constitution, which followed our coup/revolution, was very progressive, and they wish that we had used that as the basis of the constitution that we keep going through. But unfortunately, this, the latest draft constitution, just as Morsi's constitution, was based on 1971, which by most measures is much more repressive than the 1954 one.
And of course introduced the article on the foundation, one of the principal foundations of law being Islam. Principles, right. Sorry, the principles of Islam.
Yes, and Article 2 and Islam and Islamic principles and Sharia and all of that, which, as Amira wisely pointed out, just basically makes everything else moot. I mean, it doesn't matter, you know, you can sign, Egypt has signed CEDAW, Egypt has signed, as so many other countries in the region, so many wonderful international conventions that give it this cachet of belonging to a global club. But you have these asterisks there, which says basically if it violates our culture and religion, then we're not going to respect it, which basically means that they're irrelevant, they're meaningless. I don't know why our countries keep getting away with that and being allowed to say, we've signed these great conventions. So anyway, back to the Constitution. This latest draft that we're going to be voting on in January does have specific language about women. It says, and it seems to be quite good in the sense that it says that women, the state guarantees women's achievement of equality, but it's all about the wording again, and it protects them against all forms of violence, and it bans sex trafficking, sexual violence, and prostitution. But again, it depends on how that's going to be implemented, because when you look at the Constitution, it's one thing, and you look at the law, it's another thing. We don't have a specific law in Egypt against sexual violence. We don't have wording to protect women from street sexual harassment. According to the Egyptian Penal Code, a husband can beat his wife with quote-unquote good intent, and that good intent, I know, right? I did it for your best interest, darling. Good intent basically means that you don't bruise her face or leave a lasting mark. So, and you know, if you look on the reality of, and we have no laws against marital rape in Egypt, as most countries across the region, no laws against marital rape. And you know, in reality, if a woman tries to report domestic violence in Egypt, regardless of what the Constitution says, she'll be sent right back home, well, both by her family and the police.
As we heard this morning, the
exactly.
experiences in India and also South Africa.
Exactly. So I think, you know, when you look at the Constitution now, there's a great deal of effort that goes into saying, we're going to make this much better than Morsi's constitution. It's all about outdoing the Islamists and showing that, you know, we're much better at doing this than the Islamists. But when it comes to women's rights, we have to remember, unfortunately, a lot of people in Egypt, when Morsi was in power, went out of their way to say, look at the Islamists, they're so sexist, they're so misogynist. But they were the tip of an iceberg in Egypt. It's not just the Islamists who were misogynists, it's the entire society. But it was very easy to point to the Islamists and say, you guys are sexist bastards, but everyone else is great. But no, it's the entire society. So now they've gone. Now what are we going to do? We look at our constituent committee. Out of 50 members, only 6 are women. So, I mean, you know, we haven't done a great job. You know, you mentioned Ennahda. Ennahda's doing a much better job than, say, the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in the Guardian Council, which votes the Supreme Guide, is all men. There's no women. But the political parties outside of the Muslim Brotherhood are even worse, just as you were saying, you know. They have their kind of like quotas. Well, they don't even have quotas. They have their women's committees that basically achieve nothing. We don't have a quota in the draft constitution for women's representation for Parliament. And our last Parliament was the worst in terms of women's representation. 1% is the worst parliament in modern Egyptian history. This is our parliament after the revolution began. So we have a long way to go. But I just want to make very clear that Islamists or not, secular or not, we have a huge women's problem. And we have to be honest about that, because if we just blame it on the Islamists, who do not believe in gender equality and have never hidden this, if we just blame it on them, we're never going to fix anything. We have to acknowledge that we have a societal problem, and this constitution is not going to achieve anything unless we have the law to back it up, and we have the awareness in society to back it up.
Can we pick up on that point about the law? Because, of course, the devil is in the detail, not just the law in the books, but as we heard earlier today, also the law in action.
Yes.
So if I just to go to both of you in terms of sort of the most important legal reforms that you would like to see in your countries, respectively, moving forward?
Okay, so again, in Tunisia. In the beginning, when the women activists started asking for women's rights in the constitution, they asked for the law of Bourguiba. It's a code, actually, the family code. and they wanted it to be constitutional. But we, I mean, I don't want to say we the youth, but it was we the youth. We said, no, we don't want the Code of Bourguiba. Bourguiba was a very modernist guy in 57, but I mean, for me in 2013, I mean,
times are changing. Even
I don't
in Tunisia.
use a pen, I use an iPad. I don't want the law of Bourguiba. I want a law. I mean, for example, I mean, when we take ourselves, I mean, when I talk to my mother, I give as example Iceland, Norway, Denmark, I don't know, UK. My mother, when she looks to women's rights in Tunisia, she says, see, Egyptian, Libyan, and Algerian, I don't care about how Egyptian are bad. I want to be as good as Norway because I think we can be as good as Norway. So we said we don't want the Code of Bourguiba, and we would absolutely not want it constitutional. We want just an article, clear, saying women and men are equal. And then we will do the work. Don't worry, we will change regular law because before you need the constitutional law to change the other laws. So now my job next year, if we vote for this constitution, will be to go to the Constitutional Court to sue each little small law that no one ever heard about it, which is not regular with this constitutional law, because we do have one.
Can you give me an example of a priority law?
The Code of Bourguiba. I will give you one of the Code of Bourguiba. One of the Code of Bourguiba is, of course, men and women can marry freely, and that's excellent. You don't need your father to be okay with your marriage, etc. But when you are a Muslim woman, you can't marry a non-Muslim guy. Yes. So, of course, 99% of Tunisian women don't marry a non-Muslim guy. Not because the law says no, but because they don't want to, and they don't even have the chance to meet a non-Muslim guy in Tunisia. so anyway, it's not a big deal, let's say. But there are women who are, for instance, in this case. For example, today in our assembly, we have a Tunisian MP married to an American Jew. Okay, she's an MP, and she's writing this constitution. And in this constitution, her committee, she's seeing 99% of MPs who are against changing this law, knowing that she will be what we call the founding fathers or mothers of this new identity or new Tunisia. So these are the law that we're changing. But for example, I'm going back to this stupid law of not marrying whoever you want because he's not from the same religion. In Tunisia, we have actually, since we have women going to study abroad, we have some women married to non-Muslim and they are having kids. But the law said that Tunisian woman can give her nationality to her kid.
She can.
Yeah, she can. So they found themselves not recognize it as married, but recognizing the child as a legal, what is the
legitimate, yeah.
Legitimate kid. So that's absolute schizophrenia, actually. And this is how it's changing. It's changing the hard way because now we have more than 2,000 kids who are having this issue, actually. And so it's just changing. So returning by the example, my mother would say, yes, so what you should deal is to find a way so they create a law for these women so they can recognize them married but not married the Tunisian way. But they are married the other way. Okay. Yeah, really, I mean, we have MPs who are very women's rights MPs who are saying, yeah, let's try and find a way. And we're like, no, we want to be married illegally. We want to stay illegal because they have to look to the kids and to say that these kids are Tunisian. So, and this is why the law will change. And it will be not another way, but it will be the Tunisian way. They have to recognize it because now it's becoming a mess in Tunisia with this illegal marriage.
And that's just one small example of inconsistencies and paradoxes across the board. I want to switch for a moment, actually, to Syria. I mean, we're talking about, despite our troubles in both Egypt and Tunisia, we're looking at states which are in a very different position. You know, we are talking about constitutions, we are talking about legal reform and implementation. Very different situation, obviously, in Syria at the moment. Very different challenges to face. Rola, can you really take us through the evolving situation of women in Syria, and in particular, given your emphasis on your own work in terms of health? Again, one of the few successes for women in the Arab region have been gains in maternal health and in child health, declines of about 60% in maternal mortality over the last 10 to 15 years. This has been one of the bright spots in an otherwise sort of cloudy picture. But I'm wondering what's happening now for women, both sort of within their health and welfare, but more generally as this situation evolves.
Okay, so I think firstly probably important to just sort of say a thing or two about the women pre the revolution, pre the protest, where you have up to 85% unemployment amongst women. Obviously, there's a variety, a variation between the cities, a bit like what Amira was saying, where there is the educated elite who are going to universities. They are doctors, lawyers, but they are the minority with a hugely, largely unemployed population. With the beginning of the revolution, I think thousands and thousands of women found their voice. And for the first time in a very male-dominated society, they were being included as equals with their men, encouraged to protest, to be activists, to deliver aid, etc. So, and that voice, there is that remains that voice in political engagement. So there are women's groups for civil societies, democracies, and now trying to join the coalition forces. So going into politics. So there is still some positive elements to it. But sadly, I think the overwhelming effect has been negative. So if we're talking about health, I mean, when we're talking about 13 million who are now homeless, majority women and children, when you are homeless, you therefore don't have the basic ingredients for health. You don't have clean water. You don't have adequate nutrition, you don't have shelter and safety. And we're seeing huge rises in infectious diseases. Polio that's been eradicated for nearly 20 years is now coming back. And we're seeing typhoid and various other infectious diseases. So the very basics are missing now. Added to that, we've got a near total destruction of the health system. What very few people know is that the health system has been targeted by the Syrian government. Doctors, nurses, and hospitals have been specifically targeted and using healthcare as a weapon of war in Syria, basically. So we've got over 60% of our hospitals have been destroyed. Most of the doctors have left the country. So to give you an example, Aleppo is our largest city. Out of the previous 5,000 doctors, there's now 35. And if you go to the biggest hospital in Aleppo, which receives up to 250 patients a day, you are seen by 2 medical students, a vet, a dentist, and a secretary. That's who will see you when you come in with your bomb, with whatever it is, or non-violence related injury. So there's a huge destruction of the health system.
And this is hitting women hard.
Absolutely. So there's no antenatal care, there's no postnatal care, there's a huge rise in premature births. And when you have got your premature baby, there's nowhere to look after your premature baby. So lots of infant mortality. And if they get beyond the baby phase, then the mothers have got real nutrition problems. So there's no baby, she's not able to breastfeed. There's no baby milk, and we're seeing huge number of cases of starvation, unfortunately, and death from malnutrition. And if the children get beyond that stage, immunizations are being actively stopped from being given to kids in the majority of the country, not the government-held areas, but the opposition-held areas. So, and that all has massive repercussions, not just for the children, but for their mothers. It's very difficult to measure maternal mortalities and child mortality in this kind of chaos. But one thing that's certainly a huge burden, but very invisible, is the mental health problems. when you are in a barbaric war and you are being forced to flee with your kids with the clothes on your back, and you are now having to be the matriarch, you're having to be the head of the household and to fend for your family, there's been a huge rise in mental health problems for the children and for the mothers, and that's a really dangerous, invisible health problem.
Can we pick up on one other sort of aspect of women's suffering in the Syrian conflict, particularly sexual violence? And Volker, we have heard quite a lot about the situation in refugee camps. Can you explain to us a little bit about what's really going on the ground and what efforts there are to prevent but indeed mitigate the impact of sexual violence for these women?
Could I just say one thing on the legal reform side, because I would like to mention one particular aspect that I think is very important, certainly from our perspective, because we also have a mandate to prevent and eliminate statelessness. And we have still 27 countries where gender equality is not guaranteed when a woman marries a foreigner and wants to confer her nationality onto the child. And we know that this can lead to stateless children as a result. And most countries in the Middle East, unfortunately, discriminate on the basis of gender in their nationality laws. And
reinforced by religion as well, and selective interpretations of Islam.
So I think but for us, it's we still have estimated 10 million stateless people around the world, not because of this particular issue, but it is one of the contributing factors to it. So if I could just mention this, because I think it is an area that requires a lot of advocacy in order to ensure gender equality in nationality laws. I would also like to confirm very much what you have said about the psychosocial needs. There are enormous psychosocial needs. We did a survey in basically all the countries around with focus group discussions with women and girls in particular, and the over 50% of people, women and girls, actually say that they have very acute psychosocial needs, and because of we have a very traumatized refugee population. Sexual violence. It is an issue that in the Syria context is particularly difficult because the type of, first of all, we don't only have camps. I mean, we have a few camps. Most of the 3 million and the 2.2 million registered with us actually live in urban areas. They live in Lebanon, it's 1,600 sites where refugees live in different, in abandoned buildings, in garages and so forth. So you can imagine to actually cover this is extremely difficult. The way to respond to it is to identify safe areas where women can meet. And we actually have managed to do this in basically all the countries with local partners and also some of the international NGOs to actually have safe spaces where women can talk and have a safe area where they can, if they want, talk about experiences, especially, I must say, also of domestic violence or intimate partner violence that is often a result of very crowded conditions, result of men very frustrated if men live among them, and unfortunately acting out in a violent manner against women and girls. So, but there's a lot of cultural inhibition to talk about it. So you need to create a very safe area, safe space for people to come forward and then deal with the issue through referral pathways and other things through service providers.
I think, like in the rest of the world, there's a huge stigma attached with rape. And unfortunately, what we're finding is that the women are sort of falling victim twice, if you like. First, as they fall victim of the rape, and then the second time is the social exclusion now from their society. If they are married, they're getting divorced, their families don't want them. There are lots of honor killings that are going on. And the sexual violence is happening in two places. So you've got inside Syria, where government forces and the government paramilitary are carrying out the violence, often against minors. My dad's a gynecologist, and he was referred an 11 and a 14-year-old pregnant girls from as a result of that, and they were abandoned by their family. His dad said to him, "I will kill her." So if I, you know, that's the only thing he can think to do in this situation, such as is the stigma and the education level. And then you've got obviously in the refugee population. Which in the urban areas is very difficult, can be difficult to mitigate. But there are also some problems in the refugee camps. For example, you know, there's I think like kind of, you know, one toilet for hundreds of women, and the toilet doesn't have any light above it. You know, well then it doesn't take a genius to work out that, you know, in a desperate situation with a lot of traumatized people around, if you've got a dark alleyway, you know, trouble might happen. You know, so there are some things that can be done by the UNHCR and by the various sort of INGOs to try and mitigate that. But I think part of it is that the stigma that we have in our society against these issues, we don't talk about them, and that's sort of linked to the mental health problems as well. We don't talk about that, that's stigmatized. So that, I think, needs to be changed.
I just wanted to come to Mona on this. We don't talk about it because one of the steps forward in Egypt is that, for example, when I started writing my book in 2007, 2008, hardly any woman would publicly admit to having been sexually harassed, let alone raped. And yet we now have seen a few women, I mean yourself included, have spoken out about your experiences either at the hands of the state or fellow citizens in terms of gender-based violence. How far do you think that outspokenness is taking us? How effective do you think that the civil society movements we've seen rising up against sexual harassment are proving, and what more is it going to take to really make a difference to the daily lives of women?
Right. I think it's really important when we talk about sexual violence in Egypt to put it in somewhat of a historical context. We have to remember that it's not just because we went to the streets in 2011, which again didn't just happen overnight. There was a woman on a panel earlier who said, this doesn't just happen overnight. You've got a lot of build up to this, exactly, with both the revolution and the awareness of what's happening regarding sexual violence. But you can go back to 2005 and see how the Mubarak regime in 2005 specifically, because it was a year of great activism and street protests, the Mubarak regime was using systematic sexual assault against female activists and journalists in Egypt. And this was all documented. And no one was held accountable. Now, when the regime violates women sexually, it basically gives a green light that says women's bodies are fair game. So there's no surprise that then the street feels that it can start to violate women, or it can continue to violate women's bodies sexually and get away with it. And we've had this problem of street sexual harassment in Egypt for decades. But you know, at various times it was called flirtation. And then we started using a word in Arabic, taharrush, which roughly translates into harassment. But we still need a tougher word than harassment. So now you're seeing more activists on the ground using the words sexual violence or onfeginsi. And it's really important to use the words, because unless you have the words, you end up calling it something, you know, wishy-washy and meaningless, like flirtation and harassment, a word that I do not like, because it often involves, you know, physical contact, unwanted physical contact. Anyway, so 2005, the Mubarak regime, systematic sexual assault. 2006, horrific sexual assaults at the hands of just ordinary men in downtown Cairo during a religious festival. And those two events, for a lot of activists on the ground, were pivotal in drawing more awareness to sexual violence in Egypt. Fast forward to 2011 now, in the revolution and what's been happening since. More and more women have been willing to speak out about sexual violence. And what that's done is to begin to break the taboo about what's happening in Egypt. But we need much more. I mean, we also have grassroots groups that go out during protests now with the specific aim of extricating women from mob sexual assaults. Because to this day, we don't know who's responsible. Is it just the regime as it was in Mubarak's time? I mean, in my case, I was sexually assaulted by the riot police. So I knew who sexually assaulted me, and I was threatened with gang rape by their supervising officer. But there's also sexual assaults and violence that happen on the street from plainclothes people. Are they from the regime? Are they just regular men who figure there's a big crowd of women? Or is it this anger that basically aims at driving women out of public space? Because Egyptian society recognizes that women went out on the street and looked a regime in the eye that we recognized oppresses everybody. But once we were able to dislodge Mubarak, we looked to the right and we looked to the left, and we realized that society oppresses us as women. And that shift has begun in Egypt. And so that sexual violence and that anger to drive women out of public space, this is what these grassroots groups are fighting against, and that's why it's important that women speak out. But for me, as an Egyptian feminist, as someone who cares about the sexual and the social revolution, because in Egypt we have that double revolution against the regime and against a misogynist society, unless we take the conversation that now speaks about, I was violated by the state, they sexually assaulted me, this is my experience with sexual violence, and connect it to desire and the good side of sex, we're not going to get anywhere. We can't just stop at the miserable stories of sexual violence. We have to be able to say, I as a woman have a sex drive. I have a right to that sex drive. I have a right to enjoy sex, and I have a right to say that without being called a slut or whore or whatever other words we have in Arabic for it. That is the revolution, when we take it from outside into the home and challenge the Mubarak at home, especially the Mubarak in the bedroom.
And again, as I argue in my book, what's ironic about the situation today is that historically we have had no problem as Arabs and indeed as Muslims in discussing sex as pleasure for both men and women, and yet we find ourselves in this rather miserable situation of sex always being conceptualized as a problem or a crisis or a scandal, and a very effective tool to control both women especially, but also men.
And can I say something really quick? It's really important to discuss it too when we're talking about things like FGM. You know, the horrific levels of FGM in Egypt,
80% of girls aged 15 to 17.
Right, and when you take it older, it's like 91%. We're not going to be able to tackle things like genital mutilation unless we talk about sex, because it's about the control of women's sexuality.
Well, it's about the control, but religious conservatives around the world use sex as a tool to control because it's so powerful, particularly when you wrap it up in religion. Mm-hmm. Well, on that sensational point, I think we're going to open to questions and comments from the floor. Great, so raise a hand. A mic will come to you. So we'll take, how many mics do we have? Fantastic. We'll take one here, two here, and then a third. Please let us know your name and affiliation, and let us know also if your question is addressed to anyone in particular on the panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Jackie Hunt. I'm the London Director of Equality Now, which does international women's rights advocacy. And my question is really to Volker primarily. We understand huge logistical problems in a refugee situation. But since we have all this knowledge, for example, about one darkly lit toilet, no policing in refugee camps, but there are all these huge sort of initiatives to help deal with sexual violence after it's happened. I wonder if we could pull that aid in and all the goodwill and money in addressing it after it's happened to prevention. And I wonder what efforts have been made in terms, particularly in this situation, of making sure that people think about sexual violence beforehand and put measures in place and look at refugee camps and look at how you light toilets and look at how many toilets there are. And especially even with child marriage, if you talk about people coming to protect girls and therefore child marriage, they might not need protection if you put those systems in beforehand. So I just wondered how many efforts have been made on the prevention side in that respect. Thank you.
I'm actually going to take questions in groups of 3 and then we'll go through. Thank you very much for your point. I think there was a question there.
Yes, thank you. It's a great panel, of course, but again, I'm going to talk about the Syrian refugees. This is Jackie Malouf from Lebanon. I'm the president of a diabetes organization. I have had the chance to see up close the situation of the Syrian refugees. Definitely the humanitarian issue prevails. But I'm going to say that if it stays like this, and if the UN and other countries do not take any major measurements, I think Lebanon is next. Because most of the 2.2 million that Mr. Türk mentioned, they are in Lebanon. And some of the public schools are now as refugee camps. So schools have started, but some of them have not yet. Because what do they do with those people? I mean, they are people. They are human beings. They do have needs and necessities. I understand that. But that is making Lebanese boys and girls not go to school. So we are helping a crisis by starting one again in Lebanon. And as you may all know, Lebanon have suffered 30 years of war. So our heart goes out to the Syrian population, definitely, but we don't want to go back to where we were. So I reach out to the United Nations, and I think drastic measurements need to be done. So this is what I appeal to. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
I'm Imam Bibars. I'm going to speak as the head of a women's organization working with female heads of households in Egypt. I totally agree with most of the things you said, and it's true, we are in a we don't treat women well in Egypt since many years. However, working with the poorest of the poor and seeing what happened to the women the last 3 years, not even violence, economic disempowerment, the fact that women who are actually among the poorest of the poor, there are 57% female heads of households in Egypt. We need to do something immediately. So, I mean, there are things like we will be fighting for more rights. I think the Constitution, of course, is much better than Morsi and worse than 1954, but with the majority of Egyptian women, because we have many people who are the poorest of the poor. We have 40% of the Egyptians under the poverty line. We have 67% illiteracy rate among women. We have to work with these poorest of the poor female heads of households with economic empowerment. I mean, because you're facing two things. Either they starve to death, and really they are, and they have no choice, and they are now more victims of sexual violence and prostituting, or else, I mean, so I think different people will be working at different things. If I have a daughter, she will be Amira, she will be working on changing the law, I will be working on economic empowerment, and I think this is very important to put. Economic empowerment of women is very important. It gives them choices, even if it's limited.
Thank you very much, Iman. Thank you. I think we'll tackle the two questions really, which were essentially related to prevention. Volker and Rola.
No, just two things. On Lebanon itself, I think it's absolutely true that there needs to be a massive infusion of support to Lebanon. I fully agree. We have a 4 million population, I mean, slightly over 4 million, with almost 1 million refugees in the country. So you can imagine it's 25% of the population. That's the official number. But, I mean, the impact is enormous. It requires development programs. It requires prioritization by international financial institutions to look at Lebanon. They need a lot of support. And I think we are certainly one of your strongest advocates to ensure that that aid and that support, that infrastructural and whatever other support actually goes to Lebanon. On the issue of prevention, there are standard operating procedures when it comes to how to, for instance, set up a refugee camp. And this requires, and I think you mentioned it, for instance, the whole lighting issue is an extremely important one. The camp layout, the toilets, the disaggregation, the ensuring that for instance, paths are properly constructed in a way that one looks at it from the perspective of possible prevention of all of these measures. I mean, there are standard operating procedures in place. There are situations as well where things have been very chaotic, and I think you probably refer to the Satri camp in Jordan, where it grew extremely quickly. It's now the 4th largest city in Jordan itself. We have put a lot of effort over the last couple of months to have a governance system in place in the camp. It's been, and involving obviously the law enforcement officials as well, because quite frankly, we can't replace security forces or local police authorities when it comes to these issues. But what we call it actually protection mainstreaming, which means that in whatever relief effort, in whatever delivery of humanitarian assistance, in the water, sanitation, in the access to healthcare, we try to look at it from the perspective of how does it affect the protection of rights of women and girls. And I think it's a very strong focus of our work. And in our planning, we actually require all our staff to sit down with different groups of refugees, broken down by age, gender, and to listen to what they are actually saying, what their problems are, but what they would like to propose as solutions as well. So it's a very strong emphasis, and it's something that we collectively keep learning on. And we have actually just launched a major initiative on sexual violence in emergency situations with the US. The US State Department gave us some very helpful funds. It's called Safe from the Start, to ensure that, responding and preventing sexual violence, responding to and preventing sexual violence is actually considered a life-saving program, which is not often sometimes the case. It's not necessarily considered by some donors as life-saving, but we have really pushed to make sure that it is considered a life-saving program.
Rola, would you have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, our neighbours have been incredibly generous. No one, including us, could have predicted how the scale of the catastrophe and how long it was going to be going on for. But I think the Syria problem has really flummoxed a lot of people, and I think we now see ourselves going from, we're in a grey zone where aid has turned into development, and development agencies really need to now be actually looking at our neighbouring countries and seeing how they can actually support them, because this isn't just a case of humanitarian aid, this is now development and helping the countries surrounding us develop, because there's now huge animosity building up in some of those surrounding countries, because like you said, you know, they're perceived, you know, you're living in our schools, you're taking our jobs, and we're barely surviving, and violence has already spread to parts of Lebanon, in Tripoli, etc. So I think that there's you know, so Suma from the European Bank and other development agencies really need to look at what they can be doing to improve conditions, sort of the empowerment of the locals and the refugee population. Because people don't want handouts. You know, if you can give people some sort of ability to look after themselves and their families, and some way to earn a living, well, then they won't need to live in a school. But there needs to be that focus on it, which there hasn't been till now.
Further questions and comments. We have a lady here at the front. Is there a lady here on the side? Am I missing anyone for the moment? In the next round, and the lady beside her. We will come to you, Jackie. No, have no fear. Please.
Hi, my name is Madeleine Rees. I'm the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Great panel, really excellent. Mine is a comment, really, and a plea to all of you in this room on Syria, because we've heard about all the catastrophes that are happening as a result, but what we're not hearing is we must stop the conflict.
Thank you.
There is only one way to stop this, and that is to have a politically negotiated settlement. And we need to have women at the table. I don't know how many of you have been following it, but Brahimi is the guy who is making the decisions, who comes, who doesn't. He's the gatekeeper. We've been working very hard to try and make sure that Syrian women are at the table and are representing themselves as a third party, not as part of the opposition, not as part of the government, because they don't agree with the policies of either. They're being excluded. We've now managed to get at least as far as having a preliminary meeting on the 19th of December and in Geneva. But of course, it's got to be the NGOs who've got to do the fundraising, we've got to get the visas, we're going to have to get them there, we're going to have to arrange the meetings, and then the men will decide whether or not they will actually have a conversation with them. And it's just not good enough. After all the resolutions we've had, and all the historical analysis we've had, that if you don't have women at the table, you do not get a sustainable peace agreement, you do not get the sort of participation and transformation that you need after a conflict. And we're just not paying attention. Now, fortunately, William Hague has been very strong on this. He said women at the table means not lurking in the corridors, lobbying mediators, which is what's been suggested by the Department of Political Affairs and, I hate to say it, to a certain extent by UN Women. We need to get this mainstreamed, and I am actually advocating now that there should be another mediator appointed alongside Brahimi, a senior woman with a senior backup team of experts who can work with the Syrian women to make sure their voices are actually at the table and that the follow-up is done coherently and from a gender perspective. And if we do that, then maybe there'll be a breakthrough. Because Brahimi's idea right now is take the guys up to a 5-star hotel in the Swiss Alps, let them all learn to love each other, and they'll carve up Syria between them. And there won't be a woman anywhere near it. It'll be a Dayton peace agreement, which will be a disaster. So I think we all need to lobby hard. Thank you.
Thank you for the revolutionary suggestion of having women with a full voice at the table. We had another question somewhere in this vicinity? No, it was over here. Sorry. Please, your name and affiliation.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My name is Kasia Staszewska, and I'm from Action Aid in the UK. I have a short comment and a question. And it's mostly actually about the situation in Egypt and Tunisia, although goes also very much beyond that. I mean, strong evidence exists as far as the revolutions and social transformations are concerned that very strong women's movements are key actually to the success for changing the laws and to some extent also their actual implementation. But obviously it takes more to have the successful women's movement than committed activists and individuals about enabling environment, what can you do as far as the law is concerned, but also how receptive your colleagues in the broader social movements and civil societies are to actually take up these women's rights key demands. And this is the question I have to the panel. What are your experiences working together with your fellow comrades, people participating in the revolution beyond the political parties? Are they receptive to take the women's rights demands beyond actually paying the lip service to this issue? Or democracy first and then women's rights will come naturally?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, which we'll come to.
Hi, I'm Mariam Pasha from Migrants' Rights Network. Just wanted to say first thank you as a Middle Eastern woman. It's so wonderful to hear such articulate and strong voices. My question is more to ask if you have anything, if you're thinking or if you have any comments to do with the mental health situation and this idea that we know from other studies and other conflicts in the past that traumatic experiences of men, for example, can manifest after in increased domestic violence or violence towards women, and how, in a way, looking at men's mental health is a preventative tool when you're looking at post-conflict situations, and if that's ever a consideration in the work that you do. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. And Jackie, so long as it's very brief.
Okay, I just wanted to say something I forgot to say earlier, that if you're an NGO now in Lebanon, and I'm the president of an NGO, and you're writing a proposal, they tell you, you know what, the key to get your money, write something about the refugees. My ethics do not allow me to do that. We are a Lebanese organization. Wherever we're going with our diabetes awareness campaigns, if the lady who's coming to be tested is Syrian, I couldn't care less. She's a human being. And that's beyond, so we don't discriminate with that. But I'm not ready to write that what we are doing is targeting the Syrian refugees in order to get my grants. I think the UN should make that more neat, clear, and honest, and not it's impossible to get a grant if you don't mention the refugees. So this is also a point that you should consider. Thank you.
Well, plenty of take-home messages in this round. Let's deal with the very excellent point, really, about the connectivity between women's rights groups and the broader movement in our countries for human rights. Historically, a number of women's rights groups have had a real credibility problem, certainly in Egypt, but also in Tunisia, because they have been seen as historically part of the state feminist movement and have really not appealed to the grassroots. So I just want to augment that question, really. So do you see other groups interested in various aspects of human rights really taking on board women's rights as a priority? And two, do you see the emergence of new feminist groups as taking a different approach to the sort of old school women's rights movements that we've seen in our countries?
You're absolutely right in that the longer, what you were saying about Bourguiba and feminism and how it was the path for Western allies. In Egypt, we've historically had it as kind of like the pet project of dictators' wives, that, Jihan's law or Suzanne Mubarak's this or that, as if they owned feminism. And so for the older generation of feminists in Egypt, they have, some of them have been tainted by association, but some of them haven't. And you have veterans like Nawal Saadawi, who was imprisoned by the Sadat regime. But for some people in Egypt, she's considered too radical. So you have like the very, very radical feminist, you have the dictator's wife's version of feminism, and then you have a huge generational gap. But what gives me hope is that generational gap and the revolution has given birth to much younger feminists who were involved in the various protests that led to the revolutions, who are coming up with really fantastic ideas of ways to tackle sexual violence. of also confronting Egyptian society with ideas that perhaps were considered too radical and just kind of dumped with women like Nawal Saadawi that people didn't want to hear about, but are now being pushed among the younger generation. But their challenge is that, many of you who come from countries that have had revolutions or uprisings of any kind, just because a man is a revolutionary doesn't make him a feminist. This is a huge problem. And I've had people say to me, but these men have spent years in jail. And I say, and? Okay, so they know how to fight the political repression, but they don't know how to fight the misogyny. So I hear from a lot of men who say to me, this isn't a priority right now. You're talking about sex, you're talking about feminism. We need to get people out of jail. We need to help political prisoners. We need to end military trials. Yes, we have a long laundry list of problems, but each of us has a role to play here. Not all young activists want to be identified as feminists. Fine. Those of us who do identify as feminists and who recognize that unless 50% of that population is included in the calls for bread, liberty, and social justice, our revolution will fail. So even if you don't want to call yourself a feminist, you have to recognize that women's rights are a priority. They can't wait. And then you have to figure out on the spectrum where you lie. Not all of us have to do the same job. If you don't want to talk about sex, don't talk about sex. Go and talk about literacy. If you don't want to talk about literacy and you want to talk about banning military trials, do it. Because we have activists along that spectrum. What I don't want is for us to end up fighting, because when we fight, the regime gets stronger. We need to recognize that each of us has a different role to play, and to give each other that space, and to recognize in all that activism, we strengthen each other.
Amira, are you finding that's what's... Are you finding that connectivity emerging in Tunisia?
Actually, I'm going to speak about myself. I've never been in a women's rights NGO during Ben Ali's regime. I never talked about women's rights during Ben Ali's regime. We had a bigger problem, which was a dictatorship. So, I was always saying everywhere I went that women and men were really equal in Tunisia, because we both got beaten and arrested and banned from our country.
Equally oppressed.
Yeah, really equally oppressed. So there were a real equality, gender equality. I saw that women's rights became a priority, as you said, now, because now we are shaping a country. Now we are building a democracy, so we are building the fundamentals of this democracy, and one of the biggest fundamentals in the Arab region. And actually, we're not talking about the Arab region, we are talking about the Muslim countries, because we say Arabs not to be discriminatory against religions. But the problem is Muslim countries. And when we talk about Muslim countries, women's rights is clearly one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. Then, during these 2 years, of course, I am in the parliament every day and in committees every day, trying to lobby and advocate for women's rights, among other rights, of course, but it's one of the most important ones. But when we go out and when we talk mostly with the funders, not the NGO, the funders in Tunisia who are coming with lots of money to help girls' education. Women's participation in political parties, women's microfinance, women's I don't know what. We see that there is a problem, because actually what we need is not to get women to school. What we need is to get women and boys to school. What we need is to educate both. What we need is to change the mentality of both and not only women. For example, I think the UN actually helped a pilot project in a region in Tunisia where they decided to build a school to help little girls to go to school, because it was not, school was not accessible. And so what we saw is, for the first time in Tunisia, it was not a mixed school first. I mean, all Tunisians went to a mixed school, but more than that boys started hating these girls because they had the right to go to school while no one thinks about them. And so, and this is very important. I mean, in Tunisia, why is it different? Why is it different in our parliament to have women, and we're not surprised to have women in our parliament, because we are born in this mixity. We are used to this mixity, and this is a key thing that has to be done in the Arab countries, the mixity, not only women's rights, mixity, real gender equality.
Human rights.
Human rights, actually, yes. And so this is one. Second, the problem is in Tunisia, at least when we talk about economy and social rights and socio-economic problems, when we talk about women, we always talk micro. I mean, it's crazy. We can't be macro. We are only micro. When you help women, it's micro. When we talk about our rights, it's not taken as a whole right, I mean, as a citizen. It's because we are women, so our rights are different. When we talk about helping women to work, it's, yes, yeah, let's give them $2,000. Maybe they can do something with $2,000. Knowing that in the same region with the same uneducated people, they will give the man $10,000 and $20,000. And these are also other problems that even us, even not us, you as a West, because I mean, even the West is doing a huge mistake regarding women in these countries, because actually when they help these countries, they are discriminatory against men. Yeah. And then men, when they are in home, they
reverse the process.
Yeah, they
continue the process. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and it came up here about sort of understanding more about men and their pressures and what drives their behavior towards women. It's also key to the puzzle. For as long as we conceptualize men as part of the problem and not part of the solution, we are not going to get as far as we need to go in empowering both. So on that note, we're going to conclude this session, but this is not the final word, because we will be continuing the conversation in the action group this afternoon, which starts at 2 p.m., I think?
No. 2 p.m. is another session.
Okay.
And the action group at 3:30.
Action group at 3:30, reconvening in this room at, action group at 4 p.m., reconvening in this room for another stimulating plenary at 2 p.m. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to you as well.